Good evening. I hope everyone's doing well this lovely Sunday. Today we are going to finish up The Plague Ship by Andre Norton. As a reminder, this book was published in 1956, 1957, so it is an old book. And it is public domain, so if you wanted to go and read it yourselves after this, you can go to Gutenberg.org and get yourself a free copy. That is Andre Norton. And yeah, it might also be a shorter episode today because I think there's only about half an hour's left in the book. So yeah, I hope you'll join me for this probably shorter reading. Chapter 27, In Custody. To those of you who do not travel the star trails, our case may seem puzzling. The words were coming easily. Dane gathered confidence as he spoke, intent on making those others out there know what it meant to be outlawed. We are patrol posted, outlawed as a plague ship, he confessed frankly, but this is our true story. Swiftly, with a flow of language he had not known he could command, Dane swung into the story of Sargol, of the pest they had carried away from that world, and at the proper moment he thrust a gloved hand into the cage and brought out the wriggling thing which struck, vainly with its poisoned talons, holding it above the dark table so that those unseen watchers could witness the dramatic change of color which made it such a menace. Dane continued the story of the Queen's ill-fated voyage, of their forced descent upon the Eastat. Ask the truth of Intersolar, he demanded of the audience beyond those walls. We were no pirates. They will discover in their records the vouchers we left. Then Dane described the weird hunt when, led by the Hoobat, they had finally found and isolated the menace, and their landing in the heart of the Big Burn. He followed that with his own quest for medical aid, the kidnapping of Hovan. At that point he turned to the medic. This is Medic Hovan. He has consented to appear in our behalf and to testify to the truth that the Solar Queen has not been stricken by some unknown plague, but infested with a living organism we now have under control. For a suspenseful second or two, he wondered if Hovan was going to make it. The man looked shaken and sick, as if the drastic awaking they had subjected him to had left him too dazed to pull himself together. But out of some hidden reservoir of strength, the medic summoned the energy he needed, and his testimony was all they hoped it would be. Though now and then he strayed into technical terms, but Dane thought their use only enhanced the authority of his description of what he had discovered on board the spacer and what he had done to counteract the power of the poison. When he had done, Dane added a few last words. We have broken the law, he admitted forthrightly, but we were fighting in self-defense. All we ask now is the privilege of an impartial investigation, a chance to defend ourselves, such as any of you take for granted on Terra before the courts of this planet. But he was not to finish without interruption. From the playback over their heads, another voice blared, breaking across his last words. Surrender! This is the patrol! Surrender or take the consequences! And that faint sighing which signaled their open contact with the outer world was cut off. The comtech turned away from the control board, a sneering half-smile on his face. They've reached the circuit and cut you off. You're done. Dane stared into the cage where the now almost invisible thing sat humped together. He had done his best. They had all done their best. He felt nothing but a vast fatigue, an overwhelming weariness, not so much of body, but of nerve and spirit, too. Rip broke the silence with a question aimed at the tech. Can you signal below? Going to give up? The fellow brightened. Yes, there's an intercom I can cut in. Rip stood up. He unbuckled the belt about his waist and laid it on the table, disarming himself. Without words, Ali and Dane followed his example. They had played their hand. To prolong the struggle would mean nothing. The acting captain of the Queen gave a last order. Tell them we are coming down unarmed, to surrender. He paused in front of Hovan. You'd better stay here. If there's any trouble, no reason for you to be caught up in the middle. Hovan nodded as the three left the room. Dane, remembering the trick he had pulled with the riser, made the comment, We may be marooned here. Ali shrugged. Then we just wait. and let them collect us. He yawned, his dark eyes set in smudges. I don't care if they'll just let us sleep the clock around afterwards. Do you really think, he addressed Rip, that we've done ourselves any good? Rip neither denied nor confirmed. We took our only chance. Now it's up to them. He pointed to the wall and the teeming world which lay beyond it. Ali grinned wryly. I note you left the what-you-call-it with Hovan. He wanted one to experiment with, Dane replied. I thought he'd earned it. And now here comes what we've earned, Rip cut in as the hum of the riser came to their ears. Should we take to cover? Ali's mobile eyebrows underlined his demand. The forces of law and order may erupt with blasters blazing. But Rip did not move. He faced the riser door squarely, and drawn by something in that stance of his, the other two stepped in on either side so that they fronted the dubious future as a united group. Whatever came now, the Queen's men would meet it together. In a way, Ali was right. The four men who emerged all had their blasters or riot-stun rifles at the ready, and the sights of those weapons were trained at the middles of the free traders. As Dane's empty hands, palm out, went up on a line with his shoulders, he estimated the opposition. 2 were in the silver and black of the patrol, 2 wore the forest green of the Terra Police, but they all looked like men with whom it was better not to play games. And it was clear they were prepared to take no chances with the outlaws. In spite of the passiveness of the Queen's men, their hands were locked behind them with force bars around their wrists. When a quick search revealed that the 3 were unarmed, they were herded onto the riser by 2 of their captors, while the other pair remained behind, presumably to uncover any damage they had done to the tower installations. The police did not speak except for a few terse words amongst themselves and a barked order to march delivered to the prisoners. Very shortly they were in the entrance hall facing the wreckage of the crawler and doors through which a rugged gap had burned. Ali viewed the scene with his usual detachment. Nice job, he commended Dane's enterprise. They'll have 'em moving. Get going, a heavy hand between his shoulder blades urged him on. The engineer apprentice whirled, his eyes blazing. Keep your hands to yourself. We aren't mine fodder yet. I think that the little matter of a trial comes first. You're posted. The patrolman was openly contemptuous. Dane was chilled. For the first time, that aspect of their predicament really registered. Posted outlaws might, within reason, be shot on sight without further recourse to the law. If that label stuck on the crew of the Queen, they had practically no chance at all, and when he saw that Ali was no longer inclined to retort, he knew that fact had dawned upon Kamil also. It would all depend upon how big an impression their broadcast had made. If public opinion veered to their side, then they could defend themselves legally. Otherwise, the moon mines might be the best sentence they dared hope for. They were pushed out into the brilliant sunlight. There stood the Queen, her meteor-scarred side reflecting the light of her native sun, and ringed around her at a safe distance was what seemed to be a small, mechanized army corps. The authorities were making very sure that no more rebels would burst from her interior. Dane thought that they would be loaded into a mobile or copter and taken away, but instead they were marched down, through the ranks of portable flamers, scramblers, and other equipment to an open space where anyone on duty at the visa screen within the control cabin of the spacer could see them. An officer of the patrol, the sun making an eye-blinding flash of his lightning sword breast badge, stood behind a loudspeaker. When he perceived that the 3 prisoners were present, he picked up a hand mic and spoke into it, his voice so being relayed over the field as clearly as it must be reaching Weeks inside the sealed freighter. You have 5 minutes to open the hatch. Your men have been taken. 5 minutes to open the hatch and surrender. Ali chuckled. How does he think he's going to enforce that? He inquired of the air and incidentally of the guards now forming a square about the 3. He'll need more than a flamer to unlatch the old girl if she doesn't care for his offer. Privately, Dane agreed with that. He hoped that Weeks would decide to hold out, at least until they had a better idea of what the future would be. No tool or weapon he saw in the assembly about them was forceful enough to penetrate the shell of the Queen, and there were sufficient supplies on board to keep Weeks and his charges going for at least a week. Since Tao had shown signs of coming out of his coma, it might even be that the crew of the ship would arouse to their own defense in that time. It all depended upon Week's present decision. No hatch yawned in the ship's sleek sides. She might have been an inert derelict for all response to that demand. Dane's confidence began to rise. Weeks had picked up the challenge. He would continue to baffle police and patrol. Just how long that stalemate would have lasted they were not to know, for another player came on the board. Through the lines of besiegers, Hovan, escorted by the patrolman, made his way up to the officer at the mic station. There was something in his air which suggested that he was about to give battle, and the conversation at the mic was relayed across the field, a fact of which they were not at once aware. "There are sick men in there," Hovan's voice boomed out. "I demand the right to return to duty. If and when they surrender, they shall all be accorded necessary aid." That was the officer. But he made no impression on the medic from the frontier. Dane, by chance, had chosen better support than he had guessed. "Pro bono publico," Hovan invoked the battle cry of his own service, "for the public good." "A plague ship," the officer was beginning. Hovan waved that aside impatiently. "Nonsense!" His voice scaled up across the field. "There is no plague aboard. I am willing to certify that before the council, and if you refuse these men medical attention, which they need, I shall cite the case all the way to my board." Dane drew a deep breath. That was taking off on their orbit. Not being one of the Queen's crew, in fact, having good reason to be angry over his treatment at their hands, Hovan's present attitude would or should carry weight. The patrol officer, who was not yet ready to concede all points, had an answer. "If you are able to get on board, go." Hovan snatched the mic from the astonished officer. "Weeks!" His voice was imperative. "I'm coming aboard, alone." All eyes were on that ship, and for a short period it would seem that Weeks did not trust the medic. Then, high in her needle nose, one of the escape ports, not intended for use except in dire emergency, opened and allowed a plastic link ladder to fall, link by link. Out of the corner of his eye, Dane caught a flash of movement to his left. Manacled as he was, he threw himself on the policeman who was aiming a stun rifle into the port. His shoulder struck the fellow waist high, and his weight carried them both with a bruising crash to the concrete pavement as Rip shouted and hands clutched roughly at the now helpless cargo apprentice. He was pulled to his feet, tasting the flat sweetness of blood where a flailing blow from the surprised and frightened policeman had cut his lip against his teeth. He spat red and glowered at the ring of angry men. "Why don't you kick him?" Ali inquired. A vast and blistering contempt sawtoothing his voice. "He's got his hands cuffed, so he's fair game." "What's going on here?" An officer broke through the ring. The policeman, on his feet once more, snatched up the rifle Dane's attack had knocked out of his hold. "Your boy here," Ali was ready with an answer, "tried to find a target inside the hatch. Is this the usual way you conduct a truce, sir?" He was answered by a glare, and the rifleman was abruptly ordered to the rear. Dane, his head clearing, looked at the Queen. Hovan was climbing the ladder. He was within arm's length of that half-open hatch. The very fact that the medic had managed to make his point stick was, in a faint way, encouraging. But the three were not allowed to enjoy that small victory for long. They were marched from the field, loaded into a mobile, and taken to the city several miles away. It was the patrol who held them in custody, not the Terra police. Dane was not sure whether that was to be reckoned favorable or not. As a free trader, he had a grudging respect for the organization he had seen in action on Limbo. Sometime later they found themselves, freed of the force bars, alone in a room which, bare-walled as it was, did have a bench on which all three sank, thankfully. Dane caught the warning gesture from Ali. They were under unseen observation, and they must have a listening audience too, located somewhere in the maze of offices. "They can't make up their minds." The engineer apprentice settled his shoulders against the wall. "Either we're desperate criminals or we're heroes. We're going to let time decide." "If we're heroes," Dane asked a little querulously, "what are we doing locked up here? I'd like a few Earthside comforts, beginning with a full meal." "No thumbprinting, no psycho testing," Rip mused. Yes, they haven't put us through the system yet. And we decidedly aren't the forgotten men. Wipe your face, child, Ali said to Dane. You're still dribbling. The cargo apprentice smeared his hand across his chin and brought it away red and sticky. Luckily, his teeth remained intact. We need Hovan to read them more law, observed Kamil. You should have medical attention. Dane dabbed at his mouth. He didn't need all that solicitude, but he guessed that Ali was talking for the benefit of those who now kept them under surveillance. Speaking of Hovan, I wonder what became of that pest he was supposed to have under control. He didn't bring the cage with him when he came out of the tower, did he? Asked Rip. If it gets loose in that building, Dane decided to give the powers who held them in custody something to think about. They'll have trouble. Practically invisible and poisonous, and maybe it can reproduce its own kind, too. We don't know anything about it. Ali laughed. Such fun and games. Imagine 100 of the dear creatures flitting in and out of the broadcasting section, and Captain Jellicoe has the only hoob hat on Terra. He can name his own terms for rounding up the plague. The whole place will be filled with sleepers before they're through. Would that scrap of information send some patrolmen hurtling off to the tower in search of the caged creature? The thought of such an expedition was, in a small way, comforting to the captives. An hour or so later they were fed, noiselessly and without visible attendance, when 3 trays slid through a slit in the wall at floor level. Rip's nose wrinkled. Now I get the vector. We're plague-ridden. Keep aloof and watch to see if we break out in purple spots. Ali was lifting thermo-lids from the containers, and now he suddenly arose and bowed in the direction of the blank wall. Many, many thanks, he intoned. Nothing but the best. A sub-commander's rations at least. We shall deliver top-star rating to this thoughtfulness when we are questioned by the powers that shine. It was good food. Dane ate cautiously because of his torn lip, but the whole adventure took on a more rose-colored hue. The lapse of time before they were put through the usual procedure followed with criminals. This excellent dinner, it was all promising. The patrol could not yet be sure how they were to be handled. They've fed us, Ali observed as he clanged the last dish back on a tray. Now you'd think they'd bed us. I could do with several days and nights of bunk time right about now. But that hint was not taken up, and they continued to sit on that bench as time limped by. According to Dane's watch, it must be night now, though the steady light in the windowless room did not vary. What had Hovan discovered in the Queen? Had he been able to rouse any of the crew, and was the spacer still inviolate, or had the Terra Police and the patrol managed to take her over? He was so very tired. His eyes felt as if hot sand had been poured beneath the lids, his body ached, and at last he nodded into naps from which he awoke with jerks of the neck. Rip was frankly asleep, his shoulders and head resting against the wall, while Ali lounged with closed eyes, though the cargo apprentice was sure that Kamal was more alert than his comrades, as if he waited for something he thought was soon to occur. Dane dreamed. Once more he trod the reef rising out of Sargol's shallow sea, but he held no weapon, and beneath the surface of the water a gorp lurked. When he reached the break in the water-washed rock just ahead, the spidery horror would strike, and against its attack he was defenseless. Yet he must march on, for he had no control over his own actions. Wake up! Ali's hand was on his shoulder, shaking him back and forth with something close to gentleness. Must you give an imitation of a space-whirling moonbat? The gorp. Dane came back to the present and flushed. He dreaded admitting to a nightmare, especially to Ali, whose poise he had always found disconcerting. No gorps here, nothing but... Kamil's words were lost in the escape of metal against metal as a panel slid back in the wall. But no guard wearing the black and silver of the patrol stepped through to summon them to the trial. Van Rieke stood in the opening, half smiling at them with his customary sleepy benevolence. Well, well, and here's our missing ones. His purring voice was the most beautiful sound Dane thought he had ever heard. Chapter 18. Bargain concluded. And so we landed here, sir. Rip concluded his report in the matter-of-fact tone he might have used in describing a perfectly ordinary voyage, say, between Terraport and Luna City, a run of no incident and dull cargo carrying. The crew of the Solar Queen, save for Tau, were assembled in a room somewhere in the vastness of the patrol headquarters. Since the room seemed a comfortable conference chamber, Dane thought that their status must now be on a higher level than that of patrol-posted outlaws, but he was also sure that if they attempted to walk out of the building, that effort would not be successful. Van Rieke sat stolidly in his chosen seat, fingers of both hands laced across his substantial middle. He had sat as impassively as the captain while Rip had outlined their adventures since they had all been stricken. Though the other listeners had betrayed interest in the story, the senior officers made no comments. Now, Jellicoe turned to his cargo master. "How about it, Van?" "What's done is done." Dane's elation vanished as if ripped away by a Sargolian storm wind. The cargo master didn't approve. So there must have been another way to achieve their ends, one the younger members of the crew had been too inexperienced or too dense to see. "If we blasted off today, we might just make cargo contract." Dane started. That was it. The point they had lost sight of during their struggles to get aid. There was no possible chance of upping the ship today, probably not for days to come, or ever if the case went against them. So they had broken contract, and the board would be down on them for that. Dane shivered inside. He could try to fight back against the patrol. There had always been a slight feeling of rivalry between the free traders and the space police, but you couldn't buck the board and keep your license or so have a means of staying in space. A broken contract could cut one off from the stars forever. Captain Jellicoe looked very bleak at that reminder. "The ices will be all ready to step in. I'd like to know why they were so sure we had the plague on board." Van Rieke snorted. "I can supply you 5 answers to that. For one, they may have known the affinity of those creatures for the wood, and it would be easy to predict as a result of our taking a load on board. Or, again, they may have deliberately planted things on us through the Salriki, but we can't ever prove it. It remains that they are going to get for themselves the Sargolian contract, unless—" He stopped short, staring straight ahead of him at the wall between Rip and Dane, and his assistant knew that Van was exploring a fresh idea. Van's ideas were never to be despised, and Jellicoe did not now disturb the cargo master with questions. It was Rip who spoke next, and directly to the captain. "Do you know what they plan to do about us, sir?" Captain Jellicoe grunted, and there was a sardonic twist to his mouth as he replied, "It's my opinion that they're now busy adding up the list of crimes you 4 have committed. Maybe they had to turn the big HG computer loose on the problem. The tally isn't in yet. We gave them our automat flight record, and that ought to give them more food for thought." Dane speculated as to what the experts would make of the mechanical record of the Queen's past few weeks. The section dealing with their landing in the Big Burn ought to be a little surprising. Van Rieke got to his feet and marched to the door of the conference room. It was opened from without so quickly Dane was sure that they had been under constant surveillance. "Trade business," snapped the cargo master. "Contract deal. Take me to a sealed comm booth." Contracts might not be as sacred to the protective service as they were to the trade, but trade had its powers, and since Van Rieke, an innocent bystander of the Queen's troubles, could not legally be charged with any crime, he was escorted out of the room. But the door panel was sealed behind him, shutting in the rest with the unspoken warning that they were not free agents. Jellicoe leaned back in his chair and stretched. Long years of close friendship had taught him that his cargo master was to be trusted with not only the actual trading and cargo tending, but could also think them out of some tangles which could not be solved by his own direct action methods. Direct action had been applied to their present problem. Now the rest was up to Van, and he was willing to delegate all responsibility. But they were not left long to themselves. The door opened once more to admit star-rank patrolmen. None of the free traders arose. As members of another service, they considered themselves equals, and it was their private boast that the interests of galactic civilization, as represented by the black and silver, often followed, not preceded, the brown tunics into new quarters of the universe. However, Rip, Ali, Dane, and Weeks answered as fully as they could the flood of questions which engulfed them. They explained in detail their visit to the Estat, the landing in the Big Burn, the kidnapping of Hovan. Dane's stubborn feeling of being in the right grew in opposition to the questioning. Under the same set of circumstances, how would that commander, that wing officer, that senior scout, now all seated there, have acted? And every time they inferred that his part in the affair had been illegal, he stiffened. Sure, there had to be law and order out on the rim, and doubly sure it had to cover and protect life on the softer planets of the inner systems. He wasn't denying that on Limbo he, for one, had been very glad to see the patrol blast their way into the headquarters of the pirates holed up on that half-dead world. And he was never contemptuous of the men in the field. But like all free traders, he was influenced by a belief that too often the laws as enforced by the patrol favored the wealth and might of the companies. The law could be twisted, and the patrol sent push through actions which, though legal, were inherently unfair to those who had not the funds to fight it out in the far-off council courts. Just as now, he was certain that the Ices were bringing all the influence they had to bear against the Queen's men, and Intersolar had a lot of influence. At the end of their ordeal, their statements were read back to them from the recording tape, and they thumb-signed them. Were these statements or confessions, Dane mused. Perhaps in their honest reports they had just signed their way into the moon mines. Only there was no move to lead them out and book them. And when Weeks pressed his thumb at the bottom of the tape, Captain Jellicoe took a hand. He looked at his watch. "It's now 10 hours, he observed. My men need rest and we all want food. Are you through with us?" The commander was spokesman for the other group. "You are to remain in quarantine, Captain. Your ship has not yet been passed as port-free, but you will be assigned quarters." Once again they were marched through blank halls to the other section of the sprawling patrol headquarters. No windows looked upon the outer world, but there were bunks and a small mess alcove. Ali, Dane, and Rip turned in, more interested in sleep than food, and the last thing the cargo apprentice remembered was seeing Jellicoe talking earnestly with Steen Wilcox as they both sipped steaming mugs of real Terran coffee. But with 12 hours of sleep behind them, the three were less contented in confinement. No one had come near them, and Venrique had not returned, which fact the crew clung to as a ray of hope. Somewhere, the cargo master must be fighting their battle, and all Van's vast store of trade knowledge, all his knack of cutting corners and driving a shrewd bargain enlisted on their behalf, must win them some concessions. Medic Tau came in, bringing Hovan with him. Both looked tired but triumphant, and their report was a shot in the arm for the now uneasy traders. "We've rammed it down their throats," Tau announced. "They're willing to admit that it was those poison bugs and not a plague. Incidentally," he grinned at Jellicoe and then looked around expectantly. "Where's Van?" "This comes in his department. We're going to cash in on those kids dumped in the kids dumped in the deep freeze. Terra Lab is bidding on them. I sent to see Van. He can arrange the best deal for us. Where is he?" "Gone to see about our contract," Jellicoe reported. "What's the news about our status now?" "Well, they've got to wipe out the plague ship listing. Also, we're big news. There are about 20 video men rocketing around out in the offices trying to get in and have us do some spot broadcasts. Seems that the children here," he jerked his thumb at the three apprentices, "started something. An intersolar invasion couldn't be bigger news. Human interest by the tankful. I've been on video twice and they're trying to sign up Hovan almost steady." The medic from the frontier nodded. "Wanted me to appear on a 3-week schedule," he chuckled. "I was asked to come in on Our Heroes of the Star Lines and 2 quiz programs. As for you young criminal," he swung to Dane, "you're going to be fair game for about 3 networks. It seems you transmit well." He uttered the last as if it were an accusation, and Dane squirmed. "Anyway, you did something with your crazy stunt, and, Captain, 3 men want to buy your Hoobat. I gather they're planning a showing of how it captures those pests, so be prepared." Dane tried to visualize a scene in which he shared top billing with Queeks and shuddered. All he wanted now was to get free of Terra for a nice, quiet, uncomplicated world where problems could be settled with a sleep rod or a blaster, and the video screen was unknown. Having heard of what awaited them without, the men of the Queen were more content to be incarcerated in the quarantine section, but as time wore on and the cargo master did not return, their anxieties awoke. They were fairly sure by now that any penalty the patrol or the Terra police would impose would not be too drastic, but a broken contract was another and more serious affair, a matter which might ground them more effectively than any rule of the law enforcement bodies. and Jellicoe took to pacing the room while Tang and Wilcox, who had started a game of four-dimensional chess, made countless errors of move, and Stotts glared moodily at the wall, apparently too sunk in his own gloomy thoughts to rise from the mess table in the alcove. Though time had ceased to have much meaning for them, except as an irritating reminder of the now sure failure of their Sargolian venture, they marked the hours into a second full day of detention before Van Rieke finally put in an appearance. The cargo master was plainly tired, but he showed no signs of discomposure. In fact, as he came in, he was humming what he fondly imagined was a popular tune. Jellicoe asked no questions. He merely regarded his trusted officer with a quizzically raised eyebrow, but the others drew round. It was so apparent that Van Rieke was pleased with himself, which could only mean that in some fantastic way he had managed to bring their venture down in a full fin landing, that somehow he had argued the Queen out of danger into a position where he could control the situation. He halted just within the doorway and eyed Dane, Ali, and Rip with mock severity. "You're bad boys," he told them with a shake of the head and a drawl of the adjective. "You've been demoted 10 files each on the list." Which must put him on the bottom rung once more, Dane calculated swiftly, or even below, though he didn't see how he could fall beneath the rank he held at assignment. However, he found the news heartening instead of discouraging. Compared to a bleak sentence at the moon mines, such demotion was absolutely nothing, and he knew that Van Rieke was breaking the worst news first. "You also forfeit all pay for this voyage," the cargo master was continuing, but Jellicoe broke in. "Board fine?" At the cargo master's nod, Jellicoe added, "Ship pays that." "So I told them," Van Rieke agreed. "The Queen's warned off Terra for 10 solar years. They could take that too. Other free traders got back to their home ports perhaps once in a quarter century. It was so much less than they had expected that the sentence was greeted with a concentrated sigh of relief. No Earthside leave? All right. No leave. They were not, after their late experiences, so entranced with Terraport that they wanted to linger in its environs any longer than they had to. "We lose the Sargol contract." That did hurt. But they had resigned themselves to it since the hour when they had realized that they could not make it back to the perfume planet. "To Intersolar?" Wilcox asked the important question. Van Rieke was smiling broadly, as if the loss he had just announced was in some way a gain. "No, to Combine." "Combine?" the captain echoed, and his puzzlement was duplicated around the circle. How did Intersolar's principal rival come into it? "We've made a deal with Combine," Van Rieke informed them. "I wasn't going to let IS cash in on our loss, so I went to Vickers at Combine and told him the situation. He understands that we were in solid with the Salariki and that the ICs are not, and the chance to point the blaster at IS's tail is just what he'd been waiting for. The shipment will go out to the Stormpriest tomorrow on a light cruiser. It'll make it on time." Yeah, a light cruiser. One of the fast ships maintained by the big companies could make the transition to Sargol with a slight margin to spare. Stotts nodded his approval at this practical solution. "I'm going with it." That did jerk them all up short. For Van Rieke to leave the Queen, that was unthinkable as if Captain Jellicoe had suddenly announced that he was about to retire and become a kelp farmer. "Just for the one trip," the cargo master hastened to assure them. "I smoothed their vector with the Stormpriest and hand over, so the ICs will be frozen out." Captain Jellicoe interrupted at that point. "Do you mean that Combine is buying us out, not just taking over? What kind of a deal?" But Van Rieke, his smile a brilliant stretch across his plump face, was nodding in agreement. "They're taking over our contract and our place with the Salariki." "In return for what?" Steen Wilcox asked for them all. "For 25,000 credits and a mail run between Zeko and Truce World, frontier planets. They're far enough from Terra to get around the exile ruling. The patrol will escort us out and see that we get down to work like good little spacemen. We'll have 2 years of a nice quiet run on regular pay. Then, when all the powers that shine have forgotten about us, we can cut in on the trade routes again." "And the pay? First or second class mail? When do we start?" "Standard pay on the completion of each run, board rates," he made replies in order. "First, second, and third class mail, anything that bears the government seal, and out in those quarters it is apt to be anything. And you start as soon as you can get Zeko and relieve the Combine scout which has been holding down the run." "While you go to Sargol," commented Jellicoe, "while I make one voyage to Sargol. You can spare me." He dropped one of his big hands on Dane's shoulders and gave the flesh beneath it a quick squeeze. "Seeing as how our juniors helped pull us out of this last mix-up, we can thrust them about an inch farther than we did before. Anyway, cargo master on a mail run is more or less a thumb-twiddling job at the best, and you can trust Thorson on stowage. That's one thing he does know." Which dubious ending left Dane wondering as to whether he had been complimented or warned. "I'll be on board again before you know it. The Combine will ship me out to True's World on your second trip across, and I'll join ship there. For once, we won't have to worry for a while. Nothing can happen on the mail run." He shook his head at the three youngest members of the crew. "You're in for a very dull time, and it will serve you right. Give you a chance to learn your job so that when you come up for reassignment, you can pick up some of those files you were just demoted. Now," he started briskly for the door, "I'll transship to the Combine cruiser. I take it that you don't want to meet the video people?" At their hasty agreement to that, he laughed. "Well, the patrol doesn't want the video spouting about high-handed official news suppression, so about an hour or so from now, you'll be let out the back way. They put the Queen in the cradle, and the field scooter will take you to her. You'll find her serviced for a takeoff to Luna City. You can refit there for deep space. Frankly, the sooner you get off world, the happier all ranks are going to be, both here and on the board. It will be better for us to walk softly for a while and let them forget that the Solar Queen and her crazy crew exists. Separately and together, you've managed to break, or at least bend, half the laws in the books, and they'd like to have us out of their minds." Captain Jellicoe stood up. "They aren't any more anxious to see us go than we are to get out of here. You've pulled it off for us again, Van, and we're lucky to get out of it this easy." Van Rieke rolled his eyes ceilingward. "You'll never know how lucky. Big Lad Combine hates the space IS blast through. We were able to use that to our advantage. Get the big fellows at each other's throats and they'll stop annoying us. Simple proposition, but it works. Anyway, we're set in blessed and peaceful obscurity now. Thank the spirit of free space, there's practically no trouble one can get into on a safe and sane mail route." But Cargo Master Van Rieke, in spite of knowing the Solar Queen and the temper of her crew, was exceedingly over-optimistic when he made that emphatic statement. And that is the end of Plague Ship by Andre Norton. Again, if you wanted to go pick up a copy of this, you can grab it from Gutenberg.org. It is free and it is public domain. Thank you so much for joining me as we read through this book. It's really kind of a wonderful, wonderful little historic, well, not historic sci-fi, but past tense. It's a sci-fi from the past, and Andre Norton actually has an award named after her in the sci-fi literature community, so go check her out. She's got a really interesting Wikipedia page. Thank you so much for joining me this Sunday. I hope you'll join me Thursday as we start a new book, and have a good rest of your weekend and a good night.